Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Republican State Senator Kyle McCarter, who is challenging Republican U.S. Congressman John Shimkus for his House seat in the 15th District. We talk to Senator McCarter about how he differs from Representative Shimkus, why he decided to run against Representative Shimkus for the seat, and his stances on entitlement reform and reducing the debt, as well as the school he opened in Africa. This runs about 30 minutes.
Senator Kyle McCarter, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you for having me.
Let's explain something just right off the bat. You are a state senator, but you are running for the U.S. Congress in the 15th Congressional District in Southern Illinois. You are a Republican. That seat is currently held by a Republican, Congressman John Shimkus, who was elected 20 years ago in 1996. Why is it that you're challenging a fellow Republican in the primary?
Well, choices are good. The people, allowing the people to determine who the nominee is part of the system, and a good part of the system. You know, they haven't had a choice for 20 years. The good news is now they have a choice. And there's some very big differences between myself and our congressman now. And one of those big differences is I believe that term limits is one of the solutions to fixing a very dysfunctional state and federal government. It's not the only solution, but it's a good one. And I believe the Founding Fathers wanted people to step out of their profession, take the experience that they had from that, apply it in serving the people and doing what's in the best interest of the people, and then get back out. And that's what I've done. I tell people I have a legitimate way of making a living in the manufacturing business. It's helped me to bring good ideas to the legislature, and it will continue to enable me to bring good ideas to Congress. But to say you're for term limits and then not even abide by them just because there's no law, I think is quite disingenuous.
Yeah, and to remind people, when Congressman Shimkus was first elected in 1996, he said he believed in term limits and would not run more than 3 terms if elected.
Correct, and that's what got him started. I mean, that promise is what got him started. But breaking that promise is one of the reasons I'm stepping in today. So I am going to term limit myself. I will not run in 2018 for the state senate. And I tell people, if I wanted, I could probably stay in this position for a long time because I've really worked hard for the people.
Are you running also as a candidate for your current position?
No, I'm in the midterm. So I'm in the middle of a 4-year term, but I won't run in 2018. 8 years is enough. I've signed a pledge to sponsor a bill for term limits for 3 terms when I get to Congress. And even without that, I won't serve more than 10. And so I believe term limits is important. I believe keeping your word is important. And as well, I agree with the governor on a lot of things. I'm the co-sponsor of the term limits bill, which is part of his agenda in the Senate. And as well, the governor himself said that people like our Congressman Shimkus should term limit themselves. And so this is about keeping your word. And so there are other things that set us apart, but the main thing here is that the people now have a choice after 20 years. 20 years is enough.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, I don't know your record front and back or your policy positions. Let's talk about those. But it seems to me that you're both conservative Republicans, and that there's, on the face of it, it seems like. I'm sorry.
I believe I am, and I believe my record shows that. I can't say the same for our congressman right now. His conservative rating is extremely low. If you compare him, let's just say, to someone we all have heard from in the debates, like Cruz running for president, a conservative review would say he's a 96. Our congressman is a 39, based on voting records. And those votes that he made in favor of the continuing resolution, in favor of the omnibus, made it very clear what he stood for. And it wasn't a government that takes a stand for legal immigration. It wasn't a government that just says no to Syrian refugees because we don't have the assurance that they can be vetted to protect the American people. You know, the response should be, the most compassionate response is just to say no. But he continues to do whatever it takes to make leadership happy and to stay in his position. And you know, this speaks to the motives. Do you make decisions that are in the best interest of the people, or do you make decisions that are in the best interest of maintaining your power, your position, and your pension? And so, to me, that's important. I see term limits solves pension problems. You don't have to argue over what the pension is going to be, what the COLA is going to be, whether it's funded and underfunded.
You mean at the federal level?
At the federal level. Term limits, you don't have them.
Well, for Congress.
And for Congress, and you know.
You'd still have pension problems relative
right,
to.
You have to deal with employees, but
Right.
you wouldn't have it in regards to the legislature.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't have it here in the state regarding the legislature as well.
So where are you different? What specifically are you different from Congressman Shimkus?
Well, I'm pro-life. I would have
I would
taken.
think Congressman Shimkus would say he
Well,
is.
but you know what? The problem is the congressman marched in front of Planned Parenthood in the district and said, "This is appalling. We all believe this is appalling what they've done." But then he marched right up to Washington, D.C. and voted to fund it twice in the continuing resolution and the omnibus. And you know, some people said, "Well, Kyle, would you be willing to shut down the government over this issue?" Absolutely, I would. You know, we need people that can negotiate, not people that can go into a deal like they did with the omnibus, and you come out and the other side says, like Nancy Pelosi said, they gave away the store. If my business, if I sent one of my salespeople in to negotiate a deal, and he came out of that and said, "Oh, it was good. We got a good deal," and the other side said he gave away the store, I'd fire that person because he didn't negotiate on my behalf. He didn't negotiate in my best interest. That's exactly what happened with the omnibus. It was nothing more than supporting and confirming support for sanctuary cities, funding and supporting the Syrian refugees, 200,000 refugees coming to this country that we have no assurance that are going to be vetted properly, and it funded Planned Parenthood. And there were a few good things in there, like the Section 179, but it was not negotiated well.
Well, let's talk about that, though. First of all, whenever I ask these questions, I don't mean at all to ask them in any way to make it seem
Sure.
like, make you defensive about it. I'm not promoting
No,
anything, but I want to
and
explain.
I'm not being offensive. This is
But as we walk through this, the federal budget is supposed to be made up of 13 separate spending bills.
correct.
But the federal budget has not been operating properly for many years.
Right.
It's almost what they're going through when they go through the normal budgeting process is almost a charade because they end up having what we call a continuing resolution that is just kind of this throw everything into one bill and
Right.
slap it together and goes off. Given that reality, and given the reality that you have Paul Ryan now as the speaker, and John Boehner, I think, wanted to just say, let Paul come in and start anew without having to have a funding crisis on his hands relative to the federal government. Is it fair to blame Congressman Shimkus when he's one out of 435 members in the Congress for a system that is broken down? And hold him accountable for, one or two aspects of a continuing resolution that would be over $1 trillion in funding. I mean, just even as a practical matter, if you're in Congress, let's say you get a great deal for Southern Illinois on coal. You might have to get that, vote for something that is included in a major bill that you're not going to like. Isn't that just the nature of Congress?
Well, it may be the current nature of Congress. It shouldn't be, as you say. These bills should be broken apart. A 2,000-page bill should not be given only 24 hours to be looked at and read. It's not going to happen. So, I mean, the structure needs to change. I agree. But given that deal, I think it was a very poor choice, and he was not the only one. You know, there were others in Illinois in the delegation that voted against that bill and believed that was the right thing to do. I would have been one of those. Now, true, the system needs to change. The way we, you know, we throw everything in there, and plus the kitchen sink, I mean, is not right for the people. And but I do hold him accountable for that, and I held him accountable for 20 years. I mean, he's broken the first promise that he made coming in, and to tell people one thing in the district, and then go watch up to Washington and do something totally different, it should not be allowed. You know, we've got families here that are struggling to meet, you know, make ends meet and live within their means. But instead of recognizing that, our congressman has gone up and raised the debt ceiling limit every chance he's had.
Can you, though, and the debt ceiling is more or less the borrowing authority for the United States, and again, just to kind of give a little back explanation for people, because this gets to be, it's not really that complicated, but if you don't follow it at all. You can't issue bonds if you can't borrow more, and you can't issue federal bonds, which are also known as treasury bills, and that's how we funded the deficit, and we've been having a deficit for 20-something years. At what point do you, are we not at risk if we take the tack that we gotta have, okay, we're not gonna pass, as you would say, a higher debt limit, but how can you have the time to make these reforms without having a lot of damage, which is, some would argue, the same thing that's happening right now in the state with Governor Rauner not coming to terms on a budget. And who's getting hurt? The universities, Southern SIU, schools across.
Right.
I want to get into what you're doing, I mean, just so people know about your Africa school too, but you got social service agencies sometimes in Illinois, you know, the poorest of the poor are getting hurt. Would we not run that risk? And again, I don't mean to say this in any way to make you defensive, but I want to just flesh out the issues and your thoughts on, I think, because that's what the other people would say, you can't just slam the door on borrowing, you're going to have to turn the aircraft carrier around and it doesn't turn on a dime.
Well, and here's how you do it. I'm not just saying, just say no. And I've never done that in the state Senate. I've never been one to say, hey, just say no, walk away. I've always come up with my own ideas, whether it's 2 or 3 pension plans, whether it's the plan that I came out yesterday with for higher education and how to fund those that have been accountable. I mean, you start, you eat this elephant one bite at a time. I mean, it's the penny plan, 1%, reducing the state this federal budget by 1%. Over 5 years, puts us in the direction we need to go, and actually puts us on track for a balanced budget. But you can't spend $130 trillion more. You have to live within your means, just like families do, just like my business does. Other small businesses, our nonprofits have to do this. The government needs to do the same. And when given that chance, our congressman voted no. Against reducing the budget for 1% only. I believe that's attainable.
One of the things, again, because people, I think, need to just follow this, and the American people are smart enough, but I think the media often doesn't explain some of the stuff in a way that they can get it. So right now, about 60% of the federal budget is entitlement spending, and that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Now we can cut those, but it would mean cutting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. About 15–16% is the defense budget, which a lot of people would say we need to increase the spending on, not cut back on that, because we're already, what the so-called flexible, I can't even think of the term I'm looking for, but the optional part of the budget is only about 19%, unless you think the Defense Department is optional, which I would say is not. So 1% sounds easy, but when you look at only about 20% of the budget is non-defense and non-entitlement, and then a growing part is going to be the interest on the federal debt. So with that as a background, it seems like you'd have to cut a lot out of these non-entitlement areas unless you want to, which would be a good thing, engage in entitlement reform and kind of get a handle on that part of the budget that's on automatic pilot. I'm sorry for taking so long about that.
No, but you have to start. You can't keep putting saying, oh, we can't fix it all today, so we don't do. You start by taking the first step. And that's not a 1% across the board. That's a 1% of the sum total. And that means some programs, and this goes right back to the thinking about how we deal with the state. Some programs you just have to say no to completely. Some programs, because, and I will say this, that you need to continue funding because the net effect of them is a lowering of the budget, like higher education in corrections in the state of Illinois that reduces recidivism, which lowers the cost of the Department of Corrections. I mean, that's an investment that we can't afford not to make. So the same thing, you look at the waste, fraud, and abuse in the VA. I mean, I've seen it. I mean, I've calculated millions upon millions of dollars. I mean, we spend $500 a square foot to build a retirement center for veterans. Do they deserve the best? Absolutely. In fact, they deserve a lot better medical care than having to wait 2 to 3 weeks and drive 2 to 3 hours to get an appointment. They need the same gold card that Congress has to go walk into any hospital nearest them.
Well, that's what I was going to ask.
And go to the front of the line.
I was going to just say that. Why do we have a VA hospital system instead of just giving them
it's a World War II paradigm that we're living
credit
in
card,
here.
as you were just saying, a credit card to go to, or a voucher? When we had the GI Bill, we didn't build colleges for GIs. We said, here's a voucher,
Right.
you can go to whatever college you want to go to.
Correct.
Why not just do that with we have hospitals marketing to fill their beds, at the same time we're running a separate, and poorly running, a separate system for veterans. So would you, that's maybe a leading question, but would you get rid of the VA system?
Let me ask, you say, what would you do if you went to Congress? This is what I would do. I would not long after 20 years to be the chairman of the Energy Committee. First of all, if it takes you 20 years, you probably were not the right person. But I would love to go in as an accountant, as a businessman, and say, let's do a forensic audit of the VA. There are millions of dollars that we can find, that we can save and deliver excellent health care to veterans. Or do we need other parts of the VA to exist? Because you can't do away with it completely. But as far as access to local providers, you have to give that to them. But there are certain things that vets need that the general public doesn't need. You know, coming back for more, they've got some mental health services that they need, and we have to continue providing them. But we're using an old system here to deliver care to the people that deserve the best. You know, so why do you choose an energy chairmanship over that? You know, veterans not going to pay. They're not going to give millions of dollars to your campaign fund. And you know what? I'm okay with that. I'll serve them for free. I'll serve them for my father, Lieutenant Colonel Chaplain, Vietnam vet, retired now, and my son, who's a captain in the Air Force, my brother, who's a colonel in the Army. I'll do it for them and for every vet there is in the 15th District. There are enough savings in Danville alone, just on construction projects, that you could give complete health care to every veteran in Vermilion County right now. And that means, here again is a big difference between myself and the congressman. The DavisBacon Act. I would repeal the DavisBacon Act.
Explain what that is.
That is the mandatory implementation of project labor agreements and prevailing wage in every construction project where federal money is spent.
So they allegedly take a representation of what the salary is in a given area and say if you're working on a project, a building, a bridge, whatever it is, that's funded by the federal government, you have to pay prevailing wages.
Right.
Many argue that the number that is generated by the feds of what the prevailing wage is far too high than the reality for the wages in that area.
And here's, we don't need to look very far. Here's this example. The retirement community for a 10-bed, 10,500 square foot facility. The price tag, $5 million. That's almost $500 a square foot. You can go build a new house in the Midwest for anywhere from 80 to 100. You can build a commercial building for just a little more. They deserve the best, but they don't deserve this kind of wastefulness. We could have served 50 veterans instead, had 50 beds instead of 10 beds. You know, this is a ripoff to the taxpayers, and in this case, a ripoff to veterans. Upholding the DavisBacon Act is nothing more than a set aside for a certain class of workers and people. This should be opened up to local contractors that can meet the specifications of the bid and give it to the most competitive company. What happens is you miss out on local labor, and local contractors miss out on these projects. And so,
Because they don't qualify.
because they don't qualify. And so here again is just one more very, very big difference between myself and who we've had a choice for 20 years. You know, the reason the choice looks so good is because it's never been there.
I want to just move along
Yeah.
just because time's always the enemy. And but I want to get into some of your personal background so people know who you are and kind of some of your other thoughts aside from just policy things. But just to recap, if you were to say, as you probably say constantly to the voters in the district, what's the thumbnail? Why should we elect, or why should you be elected, versus John Shimkus, who you know is, some would say, a lock on the seat?
Well, unfortunately, the congressman has become part of the problem in Washington, and that was confirmed as well by my endorsement with the Club for Growth, and I believe that I have the energy, the ideas, and the track record as a reformer in this state to make a difference in Washington. We need a representative who is much louder than the one we've had, because these issues are super important. We can't sit back and wait and say, well, we'll give you another decade to become chairman of a big committee so you can raise more money. That's not a good reason for wanting to stay in Congress. Going to serve and setting aside a time to serve and saying you'll limit your term and not be so interested in filling your campaign coffers, but serving the people is the right motive. And that's why I want to go.
I want to get to the personal side, but let's just quickly run through. I just read an article in The Economist, and it was saying the cost of regulations by the federal government is roughly $10,500 per employee, and they talked to much of the, not only Obamacare, but Sarbanes-Oxley and other things. You're also a businessman. You're a businessman who served in Congress. So let's bring, or not Congress, but the state legislature. Let's bring those two realities together. How does your point of reference as a businessman, as you see government operate, how do those two things come together? And let's talk about how government regulates the private sector, and what would you do bringing that background, intellectual background, to Congress?
I would fight against any EPA regulation that killed jobs. I would push to have the EPA's budget slashed drastically to where they don't have time to spend going after frivolous violations of their enormous law that's been created and regulations, okay? For example, on an oil rig in this district, which is big, okay? If the sign demarking what the name of that well is, right, the number of that well, if it's tilted down a little bit, it's got a screw missing, and it's a little faded, you can be fined. Not can be, but they will fine you. It has nothing to do about protecting the environment. I mean, these people are very responsible. If we can lower the cost of doing business, you give more opportunity for the workers in that community to go to work. Workers' comp is the same thing. Same thing. You've got to lower that as a cost of doing business. For a well in southern Illinois, workers' comp is $48 a hundred. You go to Indiana.
What does that mean, $48 a hundred?
That's the charge. It's 48%.
$48 per $100 of payroll?
Of payroll. That's how it's billed. You go across the state line and it's $8.
In Indiana.
And in Indiana, you wonder why we're having a hard time getting people to come and invest in this state. But you've got to lower those burdens and give the people that live here more opportunity. And it's the same, and these are things I've experienced painfully, experientially.
As a businessman,
As
I
a
want to say,
business-
so let's, part of that
this
is
is not
tell us
theory to
about
me.
your business, and I don't mean, the fact is you're a
Yeah.
manufacturer. What is it you do, your
Dip
business?
molded plastics for the power utility industry. We make the plastic covers that go on tops of the transformer and the connections to, we say to protect the birds and squirrels.
We did a story on that.
Yeah, and to keep them from blowing the fuses and creating power
And being
outages.
electrocuted. Some of the big birds like the eagles,
And the
whose,
condors and things like that.
their spread of their wings is so big compared to
That's
a
right.
little cardinal or something.
Right, they come down in light and it'll kill the birds.
So you sell those, what, across the country?
Across, all over the world, actually. And we don't do any business in Illinois, but we do a lot of business in California, Florida, Arkansas, and overseas.
How many, and you're in Lebanon, Illinois.
We're in Lebanon, and
Do you have manufacturing outside, or is that the whole?
no, just there.
How many employees?
It ranges anywhere from 25 to 35. Yeah. And so, you know, I started that business 17 years ago. My wife worked in East St. Louis as a teacher to keep us going while we were
Building the accounts.
building it up, and it's been good. God's blessed us.
We often have people say, I'm going to run government like a business. Is that possible?
I think you have to use business principles. I don't think you run it exactly, because there's different motivations, but you have to use business principles, and very simple ones, like living within your means. You don't spend more than you take in. And I think we don't do a good job, politicians don't, especially Republicans, don't do a good job of talking about how they're going to deal with these things. You know, when you say, well, you just want to cut. No, we want to do what's right, and we want to say no. Because, you know, we don't raise our families saying yes all the time. We don't say to our kids, you know, if you tell your kids yes the whole life, they're probably not going to be the greatest citizens in the world. But you say no at times, and you say, no, I do this because this is what's best for your future. The same thing. Why would any politician continue to say yes, 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 just so he can get elected? He would never say that to his own kids. What you say to your kids is, you know, you don't ever say, son, I can't wait for you to get your own link card, I can't wait you to get in public housing. You never say that to them. Politicians here and in D.C. say, son, I can't wait for you to get an education, get a job, have a family, take care of yourself, and have so much that you have enough left over to give to somebody else. That's the vision you have for your family. Why wouldn't politicians have that same vision for the people they serve? And so we just have to say, sometimes we have to say no. And we have to say, hey, 1% will help us put us on track to a balanced budget and a better future for this country. I'm willing to say no at times.
On Social Security, and again, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, and we could do an hour on that, but some of the voters might say, well, are you in favor of cutting Social Security benefits? What would you do about that? And yet the trustees report for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid say these programs are unsustainable, that they'll collapse if we don't have reforms.
I think it's much like pensions here in the state. I think you have to say to those people you've made a promise to that you're going to keep your promise. But thereafter, I think you have to say, listen, we're going to change the rules in the future. For you younger people, this is what it's going to be.
So maybe somebody who's now 25, 30,
right.
They might see the change, not the people who are currently getting benefits or even people
That's
who are
right.
50 years old. So.
Yeah, it's not fair to them. It's not fair to change the rules in the middle. But those that have the ability to change the way they save, to change the way they look to retirement, we can do things there. And there's never, the solution in government is typically not just one thing. You can't just say, get rid of it, do away with it. There's typically a compromise, and I think that's the compromise.
Before we close out, one of the interesting things, I was thinking of asking you what would surprise you, or what would people be surprised at about you. One of the things I've learned, which I found surprising and interesting, is that you started a school in Africa.
Yeah.
What for girls? Is it all girls?
For girls and boys. Yeah.
Okay. Where is it? Tell us about that.
Mostly orphans, though.
What motivated you to do it? And what is it, and what motivated you to do this?
You know, my father is a great man, and the one thing my father taught me to do is serve other people. And he taught me by example. That's all I saw him doing my whole life. our whole house was full of people all the time that he had taken in, that had been in fires, orphans, that people had been abandoned. I mean, it was the way I was raised, and so serving other people has just been, you know, I think it's the way you experience God's blessing, and that's the way my whole life has been. But we did that right out of college when I met Victoria. We spent 5 years in the mission field. We were 2.5 years living in Africa, built a medical clinic there. Now that my parents have retired, 5 years ago, we took that back over. And I tell people, instead of play golf, we spend our time helping widows and orphans. So.
And the school's in Kenya?
Kenya, East Africa, but about 250 kids, and we've got 100 orphans we take care of, and 3,000 children in the area that we provide health care for.
How do you fund it?
Just with individuals, friends, and churches, and people that have...
Just like a nonprofit raising money?
Just a nonprofit raising money, and we do a whole lot with very little. And so we're just now starting a secondary school and a vocational school. And so my wife actually, she's very much running that right now, but she loves doing it, and it's been like I said, instead of playing golf, this is what we do.
Senator Kyle McCarter, I wish we could talk longer, but
thank you for
it's a
having
busy
me.
day. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
thank you for coming, and we appreciate. You know, I often say we don't have democracy without elections. We don't have elections without candidates. So it's not easy being a candidate at any level. But thanks for your service to America. And
I'd appreciate the people showing their support me on March 15th. I'd be very grateful.
thanks. Thank you again.